Recording. Thank you. Well, this is the October 20th Crisis Stabilization Facility Subcommittee of the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force. And we will begin the meeting. I'll read the land acknowledgement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. All right, well, thank you for taking the time to come in and be a part of the subcommittee. The first thing that I'd like to do is I've continued to collect and compile some data, and I will share that, I think, here. Let me do a couple of things. And I think that gets it. Let's see, sorry. How's that? Folks can see that. I don't know if you guys are aware of it or not, but you can actually slide the view over and get a little bit larger view of this if that's necessary. So what I've done is this is data that we do collect from the providers, both Pioneer Human Services and Compass Health, relative to, I won't list them, but a number of different data components. And the top was the first quarter, if you see in the gray line, and then moves down. The top is also Pioneer Human Services Detox, and that bottom section under the blue line is the mental health stabilization data. And we talked about this previously, but I think that it's, you know, the sort of quick reference to this is in the third column over the utilized bed days, which is a division between the program bed days and utilized bed days, but the percentage of bed days gives a quick snapshot to that information. First quarter for Pioneer Human Services was a 74% utilization. They jumped to 80% in the April to June timeframe, and then went to 78% in this last quarter that we have reported ending the end of September. Which is great. They're working really hard. There's obviously been challenges throughout this period of time relative to workforce and those sort of things. So really happy to see that utilization. I'll talk about some of the other pieces briefly as well, but as well with Compass Health and the mental health stabilization. They started out with the first quarter at 50% utilization. Increased that to 53%, and then in this last quarter have increased that to 56%. That's been something that we stayed focused on, obviously wanting to use the resources as best as possible. There's been, again, some challenges with Compass Health in providing mental health stabilization just relative to workforce challenges. But also we've worked pretty closely with Compass Health relative to their admission process. And I'll talk about that a little more specifically, just to reiterate. I know that we've touched base on this in some of the other meetings, but at least in my opinion, what we're seeing in regards to that increase is the process of Compass Health moving to a more streamlined admission process. Certainly for first responders and law enforcement relative to diversion and then also working and training with their staff, you know, in regard to admission process and et cetera. Let's see if I kind of jump back and forth here a little bit. Maybe if we come over to 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth column over referrals received for the quarters. It's stayed pretty consistent. For Pioneer Human Services, they did drop a bit from the second quarter into the third quarter. When I inquired about this, just to see if there was any anecdotal information, they shared that oftentimes in the when the weather is a little bit nicer, people are a bit more hesitant to come into the facility and admit that. And we're not seeing that necessarily relative to the referrals received for mental health stabilization. Pretty consistent as far as referrals, you know, coming across that. I do try and pay attention to and broke down the specific referrals, you know, by entity: law enforcement, EMS, League, Grace, and our largest number of referrals are typically received by other professionals, and also obviously self and family. For both of the facilities, this is the highest number of referrals, which is good. These individuals aren't necessarily being assisted by first responders, you know, et cetera, but coming into the facility through other means. And yet we obviously want to continue to develop the referrals from law enforcement and EMS as we proceed forward. So I don't know if there are questions or thoughts about this. I think that we're trending in the right direction. That's what I'm most focused on. I'm optimistic and continue to work with both of the providers that will continue to see high utilization and higher utilization as far as specifically with mental health stabilization. Any thoughts, comments, questions, additional details relative to the utilization data?
You know, Perry, I'm sorry, Michael, go ahead. Your hand's up. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, thanks, Mike. I don't know, Perry, and this is more of a question. The kind of the proviso dollars for Whatcom County for the Compass Health program to basically become certified to become an involuntary kind of under the criminal code for law enforcement drop-offs. Is that part of the incarceration task force kind of scope, or is that kind of a separate project? And will that data be kind of incorporated into this great work that you guys are doing?
So great question, Michael. It certainly is within the scope of the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force relative to an interest of the Crisis Stabilization Center being a diversion process from you know, other resources that are in the community. And I will speak more specifically to that 12-hour hold. I've got a bit of an update from Compass Health in that regard. And so pretty hopeful about where we're able to go. And what I thought that I would do, because it's sort of ending up that way, I am hoping for implementation of the 12-hour hold process towards the end of the year or at the first of the year, realistically. And I'll talk about those details in a moment. But adding to our collected data specifically to gather that and then to report that out. So it's a great question. It is definitely something that we want to track just in this regard as far as the subcommittee, but obviously with the BHASO as well, and being able to you know, track that information and communicate that information. The proviso dollars are super important. I think are going to continue to be super important. And it's really been a slow start, you know, in terms of getting there. I'll get into more detail about the 12-hour hold process itself as we move on through the agenda of the subcommittee. So great question. Mike, you had a question as well or comment?
Yeah, no, just more of a comment. I noticed the base camp referrals, which is kind of cool. And only reason it sticks out at me is I talked to Representative Shoemake about how the question to me was how we could take the load off the court systems related to mental health and SUD. And I really didn't have a great answer for it, but one of the things I did tell her was that it's where those engagements can happen. And if those engagements can happen early, then they can be deferred. And I think that's really cool at base camp. So as I think about the future with the way station, and then of course base camp moving, we might spend a little more effort in there. I don't know if they were actually referred by base camp personnel or if it was one of our GRACE people that were in base camp working. And of course they come from base camp. So I'd just be interested to know how that navigation occurred, but that's an engagement point. And boy, that's a cool number to see.
I agree wholeheartedly. And one of the things that I'm interested as the Response Systems Division continues to develop is, in terms of my responsibility as a liaison relative to, county and health department and the providers in the Crisis Stabilization Center, as well as, our providers in the community, is to go out to these various locations and work with them about how can I help? Is there additional information that I can bring? Specifics about the admission process. I know that folks are aware of our systems improvement document that's online that a number of individuals have used. And I think that that's another important component. As a matter of fact, our thought process was to actually expand that systems improvement form beyond the Crisis Stabilization Center, or that being one option that people could give us feedback on and that we could follow up with, but not limiting it to the Crisis Stabilization Center, but other response systems components as well. So I agree with you. That's really positive. We don't have a breakout at this point, but are getting referrals from Lighthouse Mission as well, and some pretty good feedback, there. So, so I agree with you. Yep. Mike?
The MCOT data, Perry, does that include the DCRs?
It does.
Okay.
And so, I thought that it was interesting that obviously the DCRs are more oriented towards, oftentimes towards individuals that are struggling with mental health challenges. We know that many of those folks are co-occurring, but some referrals in both Q2 and Q3 to the withdrawal management services detox as well. And so those are referrals coming from an MCOT staff, but it is specifically DCRs, DCR related referrals to the Crisis Stabilization Center. Yeah,
I think the reason, internally with the ASO, we've been kind of tracking and kind of looking at DCR referrals to crisis stabilization or triage or withdrawal management facilities kind of across the region, and noting kind of a pretty low rate in which DCRs kind of see these facilities as viable, less restrictives, either because of transportation issues or a delay or timeline issues. So I mean, these numbers are actually really positive.
Yeah.
So I think that's just something to note, and I think probably reflects the work that you guys are doing with the facility. So that's a positive thing. But I just want to kind of, across the region, that referral has been historically low for quite a while. So we're kind of looking at ways to kind of improve that. Yeah, and it's anecdotal in nature, Michael, and we could certainly flesh this out further. But I truly, I'm biased. I guess I'll own that first. But the Response Systems Division and the way the meetings that are occurring with the different stakeholders and components of the Response Systems Division, I think that communication, the challenges that are discussed, the awareness of the resources that are available is all enhanced through that
creation of response systems division and the interest in communication, relative to that process. And obviously that it encompasses, the sheriff's office and obviously emergency medical services, as well as MCOT, just have really enjoyed a very close communication and relationship with MCOT in general and managers. And if there was a problem, and being able to get an individual admitted or transported or whatever it happened to be, address that pretty quickly. And so I think that it is a sense of these different entities that are out there, discovering that it's like, yep, it's fairly quick to get the individual admitted. We're going to get the resources that we need, and there's a higher likelihood of attempting that.
Yeah, I mean, that just looking at this data, I mean, when we look at region wide for DCRs, that type of referral is around 1%.
Wow.
So, I mean, just looking at this data in relationship to the actual bed days and utilized beds. So it'd be interesting to, I mean, it's just great work, and I'm glad that, the crisis system is, fully utilizing this the best they can. Perry, do you know that has Compass has the program been running at capacity, like 16 beds, or have they suffered staffing challenges in which full capacity is more like 14 beds or 12 beds?
I think that it hasn't been, and most certainly hasn't been at capacity, in terms of sort of hitting that peak, because of course the percentage doesn't necessarily show, day in and day out. But they have recently actually been at capacity for, days. I mean, there's varying lengths of stay, obviously, in the facility. And so I think that the cause of that has been really twofold. One, certainly workforce challenges. Individuals, I think that all of us are aware that over the last year, individuals have done a lot of changing in positions and, pursuing different kinds of positions, particularly those individuals in mental health and nursing care kind of thing. And so that really stayed in contact with the director out there and just said, hey, keep me very apprised just relative to your staffing model. The other challenge that, they run into is, of course, they have 3 shifts. And so it isn't necessarily one staff to be able to provide services. It's literally 3 staff. And so I think one of the challenges that they face is that they have, if they're down, 2 staff, they simply can't say, oh, well, we'll admit people, during this shift, because then they fall into certification non-compliance in terms of coverage and that sort of thing in the other shifts. So I know that is, a significant challenge. And I think that has been a challenge as well for Pioneer Human Services in terms of detox. They've done a great job in terms of continuing to fill vacant positions and training and the other components that are necessary relative to that. So good insight, Michael. All right, I will stop sharing just for the sake of bringing down the clutter. That information is available if you'd like a copy of this. I basically, of course, continue to update it. The providers have been great about getting me the data within the first week of the following month, and I know that they're fairly busy about it, but it really is super helpful, relative to tracking and sort of what's going on. I'm always cautious about managing from a spreadsheet because the numbers don't necessarily tell everything, but it can certainly indicate trends and reaching out to them of how we might be able to support in one way or another in that regard. So pretty good relationship, in my opinion, between the county and the providers at this point in time. So all right, so I will move to and just provide an update relative to the Compass Health Streamlining Admissions project. This, as I was making reference earlier, was really in regard to the challenges that we were seeing initially as the Crisis Stabilization Center opened relative to the numbers and utilization of available beds and et cetera, and worked pretty closely with Compass Health upper structure, as well as, you know, the staff that are boots on the ground, and was able to support them in moving to a more streamlined admission process, essentially looking at what needed to occur, particularly when law enforcement or a first responder brought an individual to the facility. And so I have just a sort of a quick list. Essentially, in the streamlined admission process, what happens is that the law enforcement or first provider can make a phone call to the Crisis Stabilization Center, get to the location that they are interested in referring an individual to. If there's any question, that's a question had come up in terms of possibly the law enforcement or first responder not knowing which service was appropriate for the individual. And we assured folks that it's like, bring them. That's okay. We will absolutely determine that if there is some question of whether it might be detox services or mental health stabilization that is primary and is needed. So when the staff or when the first responder, law enforcement makes that call, the staff have been trained to ask a set of questions, including client's name, date of birth, current presenting concern at their description, a question about blood alcohol level that can't necessarily be answered by EMS and some first responders, as they don't carry equipment to measure BAC, but that's not an exclusion at that point in time. So that information, if they have that available, determining whether the individual is required to have oxygen, which is a certification issue for the facility. And if the individual does require oxygen, then there's a discussion about a more appropriate referral. Also, whether the individual can address their ADLs, eat independently, ambulate, etc. If the individual is a level 3 sex offender, which if that information is known, and to the referring party's knowledge, whether the individual has ever been convicted of arson. This is not an exclusion, but it is something that the staff need to be able to respond to and set a care plan in place. Assuming that the answers for the individual that are asked on the phone are no, essentially a bed is placed on hold at the facility, and they're requested to bring the person to the facility. So they're preparing for that individual to arrive at that point in time. And really what happens currently as the individual arrives is they complete a COVID test. They do complete a breathalyzer as appropriate. They'll begin tox screen, urine tox screen, and then do vital signs and admit the person. The idea and concept here, particularly with law enforcement, is to drop them off, give us some very basic information, and you're on your way, which is really, we meet, as folks are aware, monthly for Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee, and that input has been extremely important. One thing that I will say that I'm continuing to work on, and I'll bring up in this next Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee, is the idea that as law enforcement or first responders in this given situation bring an individual to the facility, and for some reason or another it's ending up as they sort of process that person, that the individual's needs can't be met at that facility, that it's the providers that will transport the individual to the appropriate location, whether that's a hospital or whatever it is that is needed. And that's just because of available transportation for the providers at the Crisis Stabilization Center. That's been a bit of a sticking point, but we're going to continue to work with that, because that is the goal for that once they've been brought to the facility and dropped off, that we want to get our law enforcement and first responder partners on their way to be able to address that. excuse me, to be able to address that need. So this streamlined admission process, I think, has been really important. And what I'm picking up anecdotally from everywhere from law enforcement through actually other entities that have submitted systems improvement forms is, yep, it's a confidence that we're going to be able to admit the individual. They are oftentimes that I don't actually get that feedback when a successful admission of a challenging individual occurred, which is too bad, because I'd love to have that kind of feedback as well. But more and more, I'm actually getting that kind of information and feedback from individuals that are utilizing the Crisis Stabilization the Center for a Diversion process. So my hope is, as more and more entities in the community are realizing that it is a fairly fluid and painless process to drop an individual off at the Crisis Stabilization Center, our utilization will increase. My goal is that our challenge is going to be that our Crisis Stabilization Center is at capacity almost constantly, and having to deal with that particular challenge. At least we're utilizing that resource. So I've really felt like we have turned a corner in terms of the understanding of the providers themselves about the importance of this, and the significance in particular of law enforcement and first responders, that they need to have a very quick turnaround, and there needs to be a minimum of barriers, in regard to that. And as I said, this sort of last one is that the providers operating from a mistaken belief system that if the person isn't admitted, then law enforcement or first responders need to take them someplace else. And it's like, nope, that's not how that needs to work. What needs to happen is that the staff needs to come together, and we need to make sure that they have resources to get that person to where they need to be. And the transportation has been, the biggest challenge. But I believe that we are gaining ground in that particular arena as well. So welcome, Doug.
Yeah, Perry, I'd offer just a little comment on that. Talking to our van driver program, they are getting more calls from the CSF for those transports. So that's perfectly great. Encourage them to do that. We'd rather get them over there safely, in that van than, so.
Absolutely. And I think that even more so, certainly don't want, the providers to be at times historically, obviously they've called ambulance and there's, challenges with that, or even used a cab, not necessarily an appropriate, method of transportation for individuals. And so we continue to work with and respond to, their concern that they don't necessarily have the resources in terms of the transportation. But that van has been, I think, really important. I mean, COVID has, thrown some pieces into this as well, but that just seemed like a definable challenge that we could definitely bring some resources to, and we'll continue to. So that's a piece that we need to address, so they feel really comfortable with an individual that it's like, yep, we've determined through, further admission process after law enforcement or first responder is left, that the person, their needs are not going to get met here. They've got a medical primary or something of that nature, and that they feel really comfortable that they have the resources to get that person where they need to go. Hugely.
I apologize, Perry. I got to go visit the fire chiefs right now, but thanks for all your work.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Hey, good morning, Perry. Sorry, I'm in reverse of Mike. I got tied up on something else on the front end. So
I can believe that. I really appreciate you jumping in and touching base. One of the things that I'll do, Doug, I talked about the data just in terms of bed utilization and so forth. I'll send you a copy of that. We have first, second, and third quarter, so you can look at percentages. And I know you look at spreadsheets all day, so it's pretty straightforward. I'll answer any questions that you might have.
Okay. Well, just from what I heard, it sounds like I agree. From what I'm not hearing a lot of complaints, and I think law enforcement is starting to see it as a resource. And I think the caution early on was, once we build it, as long as we it has to be a resource that works for everybody. And if law enforcement shows up and they're turned away for a host of reasons in very short order, they will stop to use that as it won't become a viable resource for them, and they'll do something else. They'll either go to the hospital or you know, MCOT or other programs that are out there. So I'm glad that you know, it's there's growing pains, but it does look like it's developing into a resource that people are able to utilize and see it as a viable solution.
Yeah, I agree with you, Doug, and I'm optimistic relative to implementation of the co-responder program. Deputy Bauman and Deputy Clicks in this given situation are quite verbal. They, provide a lot of information, and I know that they, of course, talk with their colleagues. So they're going to be very knowledgeable about that. And so I expect that what we will see as that is implemented here towards the end of the year, that we'll see even an expansion in terms of law enforcement drop-offs in general. We're communicating with small cities, and obviously with, I just had a meeting with Chief Mertzig as well of Bellingham Police Department in regards to utilization of Crisis Stabilization Center. Really positive meeting, just in being able to bring some basic information about how law enforcement can use the Crisis Stabilization Center. So I'm hopeful that our numbers, our utilization of beds, our law enforcement drop-offs increases as we move into the new year as well. So,
okay, I apologize if you already said it. What's the capacity of the mental health side at this point?
The capacity is a full 16 beds, and so that is something that the last piece of what we're going to move into here and talk a little bit about was also the 12-hour law enforcement holds. But they are at able to take full capacity. There are some hiring challenges relative to implementing the 12-hour law enforcement hold, but I did get feedback from Elise, the nurse care manager out there, relative to posting and interviewing for those positions. One of the challenges that I didn't understand, but understand more now, was that obviously they have 3 shifts. They have and I'll move into and talk about this 12-hour law enforcement hold implementation. They were required by their certification to have additional and specific staffing. I won't go into the details of that, but had some expansion of staffing that had to occur in order to provide that component. And what hadn't dawned on me was the fact that they actually have to hire for 3 full shifts. So it's an additional staff, but it's actually 3 additional staff that they need to maintain. And if they have a couple of vacancies, then they move into challenges being compliant with their certification through 2 of the shifts. So that's something that I'm going to continue to stand really close with Compass Health and using all the resources that they have as far as bringing new staff on. They also have had some challenges of staff moving into other positions within Compass, is my understanding, but away from the Crisis Stabilization Center. And so, we've sort of seen that great resignation that may be coming to an end in terms of where our economy and some of the other things are occurring. To that point, although it's not really specific, one of the things that we are seeing when we're posting positions for behavioral health specialists for the alternative response team, as well as the co-responder, is we're getting a number of applicants, viable applicants. And early on within the health department, when we would post behavioral health oriented positions, we got almost none. And so I'm hopeful that that trend of individuals not seeking employment that have that particular specialty is now turning towards positive resources for us. So yeah, let me, if we don't have other questions specifically, let me talk just briefly about implementation of the 12-hour law enforcement hold. we've talked about this, and I know Michael is really familiar, as well as Doug is really familiar in regards to the concepts and idea behind this 12-hour hold being related to WAC 1031-110. Essentially, it is technically an involuntary status that the Compass Health for mental health stabilization had to pursue from Department of Health. As I think folks are aware, they have been granted that certification, and now it is a matter of simply filling those 3 shifts and making sure that those staff are trained to be able to accomplish that. I also, and I planned on bringing this to our next Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee. I've made reference to before what I'm calling a visor card, for a quick reference for law enforcement to be able to, hey, there's the phone number, this is the questions they're going to ask, all the information is there for them, so they're really familiar with that. And I'm hoping the flip side of that visor card to be used for law enforcement and first responders will outline the 12-hour law enforcement hold components and sort of frequently asked questions that can come up there of, okay, well, how do I do that? Or, what does that actually mean? Kind of component. Obviously, the streamlined admission process is still in place. But there is an additional component to this 12-hour hold. I don't tend to refer to it as involuntary, only because it can create confusion for the community, but instead refer to it as 12-hour hold. So the protocol and procedure has been established for the provider relative to 12-hour holds. And I think that, again, most of us are familiar that law enforcement personnel can determine an individual that may be involved in a low-level crime, can be diverted from being arrested to being taken out to the Crisis Stabilization Center. Essentially, a discussion happens with the individual to clarify that there is a requirement that they remain at the facility for a 12-hour period of time. The staff are going to continue to work with that individual to have them remain at the facility for likely beyond 12 hours, depending on their need. And use motivational interviewing and other techniques to engage the person further. If the individual leaves the facility staff do not have the ability to go hands-on. The facility is not a lockdown facility, and so technically the individual could demand to be allowed to leave. And at that point, as the individual left, the staff would then contact the office of law enforcement to inform them that the individual had left against staff advice when they left, and whatever details in terms of their exit would be, to make sure that that information is communicated with law enforcement. My hope is that that happens rarely. Based on the skill of the staff, but that is a possibility that it occurs, and we want to have a follow-up, just in regard to where that occurs. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Michael, I see that you have a thought or a question,
or maybe both. Yeah, and this might be maybe for Doug, or maybe a future question for prosecution or whatever, but those low-level crimes that you mentioned, Perry, is there a process in place, or is there a process going to be in place in determining what those lower level crimes are? And is that kind of standardized across law enforcement? And then how does that actually, where do we go on that?
So that's a great question, and I have some thoughts too. Doug, go right ahead.
I think, and I don't have the list in front of me, but you're probably familiar with the LEAD program. Some of those crimes that they associate with people that are, the shoplifts, the trespass, the things that a lot of times are associated with people in behavioral health crisis, maybe unsheltered community. The prosecutor's office is not necessarily prosecuting this, and they're putting some of those people into the LEAD program. So I see, some low-level drug possession, maybe things like that. personal use, that kind of stuff, not obviously the sale and delivery, but I would see the crimes that the LEAD program uses is similar crimes that we would look like here. And one of the interesting things about this 12-hour hold is, when we used to do an involuntary mental health pickup and take somebody to the hospital, we had to write an affidavit, and that was really based on probable cause. Well, the 12-hour involuntary hold refers to reasonable cause. So we kind of struggle with that. And basically the direction we gave to the people is you just need to assume that's still probable cause. Basically, that person is an imminent risk to themselves. And really when it comes to imminent, it's an immediate risk. So we have to have something that we can articulate that they are an imminent risk to themselves or others if we don't take them into protective custody or try and encourage them to come to that Crisis Stabilization Center. Maybe they're not quite to the point where we would take them for an involuntary hold to the hospital, have them evaluated, have the DCR come in and do all that. So that's one of the challenges. But those are the list of crimes I would expect that would maybe some an assault fourth. So that's a gross misdemeanor. Maybe somebody just got agitated. Somebody stepped in to try and calm them down, and they swung their arms and there was an assault. But did they intend to assault them, or was it just part of the whole dynamic?
Yep.
I appreciate
yeah. That's a great summary. I have also 1031-110 does make reference to the language, the WAC language does make reference to the prosecutor's office involvement. And I've sent the WAC itself to the prosecutor's office a couple of times, just letting them know this is developing and forming. Just want to keep you in the loop as far as the time frame. And the last one that I sent here more recently was that the certification has been obtained and that we're looking at staffing. And so I will actually take responsibility to reach out again and say, hey, I really need to have a conversation with you just to make sure that you're a part of this. It's not that you need to describe the information to me, but that there's just that they're aware that this process is going on and of the language of Washington Administrative Code, and those components, to just make sure that that linkage, as much as just me being a communicator, bringing that piece together. But I think that, Doug, your experience and so forth is probably a pretty accurate description, particularly with just the challenges of individual, booking in the jail and some of those other components. It would seem like that makes a lot of sense. And I think that we're really fortunate relative to LEAD and those individuals that can be diverted from, prosecution. Being involved in the LEAD program is a great framework for, yep, this would be appropriate, an appropriate individual. And we're sort of already on that pathway to diverting individuals. So I would wholeheartedly agree. It's time to send another email out to the prosecutor's office to say, hey, just following up on last couple of emails and giving you, specific information about where we stand right now in terms of implementation and our target goal. When I reached out to Compass Health prior to this meeting saying, do you have a target date? At this point in time, I'm not trying to pressure you as much as I want to make sure that I'm, communicating and in the loop. They didn't, just relative to hiring process and training process, but I think that that's imminent is where I'm at. Yeah, Doug.
So I know there was some, even when the proposals went out, about safety and security of that facility, and, it was talked about very early on as it was going to be a involuntary facility, and it was really going to be an alternative for law enforcement to bring folks that, in lieu of taking them to the hospital, where we knew that they would be safe and somebody would immediately be addressing their current crisis. So obviously that didn't happen, but there was some talk about, similar to the hospital, when we take people, there's the initial intake room is you can secure it. It's got padding so that if somebody wants to do self-harm, kind of protects them from doing that. And I know there was some discussion early on about having a room like that at the Crisis Stabilization Facility. Did that happen or did that not happen?
Yeah, great question. It did happen. It's referred to as a seclusion room, and it's for exactly that purpose, of where individual can be placed for their safety, and also then observation by a staff at that location, because it's physically very close to the nurse center and and those kinds of components. So they do have that resource available to them. Actually, even forecasting further, that resource is available on the detox side as well. They don't have the certification, but the physical room is there. And I think that just from the experience that the staff and certainly the upper structure, the staff at Compass Health have had from working in ENTs and that sort of thing, seem very knowledgeable about de-escalation, in that process, and how to go about that. They obviously, are in that balance of individuals that are not necessarily combative but paranoid, those sorts of things, and can become physical. And they've honestly handled a number of those cases of really challenging folks verbally. And then if they needed to, I just got a report today, as a matter of fact, for an individual, got that person where they needed to be, but did so safely. And the individual did some damage to the building, instead of damage to people, is what it came down to. So I think they're operating at their highest possible level. And that's what before, I believe, was the cautionary move towards this admission process. If an individual was was challenging, I guess is the word that I'll say, just in terms of the possibility of becoming physical. And they've really extended themselves and worked with that, I think, in that interest of really understanding more of what the community, specifically law enforcement and first responders, are needing, in that regard. The other thing that I will say, and I guess it's a little bit outside of the context of our meeting here, but continuing to work towards engagement of the hospital and the emergency department staff. They are a part of our Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee monthly, but even pursuing meetings with them outside of that setting to look at protocols and procedures, admission processes, and et cetera, or referrals that are occurring back and forth between the Crisis Stabilization Center and the hospital, to ensure that we have a really developed communication and process for those referrals, so that law enforcement and first responders, for example, don't get caught in the middle of, I'm not sure what to do. One is saying here and the other is saying there, and just making sure that communication and that referral process is really nailed down. So I'm hopeful in regard to that. I know that the hospital has hired a new security director, and Deputy Clicks has been in communication with that individual. And so looking at possibly a couple of different meetings with different orientations, obviously, but really developing that communication further as a component of the Crisis Stabilization Center, and work with our law enforcement partners. So great discussion. Again, if there are other pieces of information that you need, Doug, like I mentioned, I'll send you that that data sheet that I have. And also, our last topic is actually one of interest to me, and Jill may be able to jump in here as well. In our other business topic, the discussion point of rebranding with Pyramid Communications, a outfit that is working with the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force and county administrators administration relative to the Crisis Stabilization Center. Folks may or may not be aware that there was an ordinance that was passed through the county to name the Crisis Stabilization Center the Ann Deacon Center for Hope. Don't know if you were aware of that. There's actually been a sign that's been placed out front of the Crisis Stabilization Center at this point, and I know a ceremony is being planned and et cetera for Ms. Deacon to be invited and to be a part of that, which I think is fantastic. Obviously, Ms. Deacon did a lot of work over a number of years to bring about the process and establishment of the Crisis Stabilization Center. And I know that there are discussions in this regard. One of the things that I'm curious about is the name Ann Deacon Center for Hope doesn't necessarily identify what the facility does. For a outsider or somebody that is not, knowledgeable about that. And so I only worried about if that were the official name and this is what it's going, the building is going to be referred to formally, that there could be some confusion. And I don't necessarily have ideas in that regard, and I'm certainly not opposed to obviously the naming of the building, but that was the only piece that I had. Yes, Ms. Nixon.
Hello. Yes, Perry, I think that's a really valid point, and I'm actually going to pass that along to our contractors. Just so you guys are aware, Pyramid Communications is really going to make the Crisis Stabilization Center this the center of all of its communications work for the task force, and they're working on messaging for the community. And so hopefully we can get the word out into the community in a big way about what the Ann Deacon Center of Hope is, that it's out there, that it's a resource for individuals. But definitely, Perry, if you have any other concerns regarding that about the branding and messaging, for sure, let us know and bring it to our attention.
Okay, that'd be great, Jill. I'd really appreciate it because I know that Councilman Buchanan was a part of this and so forth. And I maybe mistakenly, but assumed that there would be some discussion around that, or maybe the building just has a fairly long name in more formal circles, that sort of thing. So I'd appreciate that, and I was certainly going to bring that point up if it didn't come up in other meetings with Pyramid and the main task force or the steering committee as a possibility.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Any thoughts, Michael, Doug, just in regard to the naming of the building? Or
No, I don't. I hope that Ann Deacon continues that representation even at the highest level, even if the name is very, very long. But does Compass Health and Pioneer, what's their program names? I know that potentially changed when the new facility opened, because I know that they have their separate program names, correct?
well, yes, I mean, commonly that it's referred to as withdrawal management services and or triage services is really a common term, or mental health stabilization. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, I just know that I usually on their other facilities, like Compass Health has a couple other kind of triage, stabilization facilities, and usually they have some sort of an in-house reference name or program name specific to that scope.
Right. Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and there, I don't know with each of the ENTs and the other triage facilities and so forth, what the nature of ownership of the building is and those kinds of things. That may be a component of it. Typically, Elise Simmons refers to it as mental health stabilization. And Rob Sullivan on the detox side, either detox or withdrawal management services, which is as is a more formal description of that. So we'll see. I just, again, I wanted to make sure that just in terms of, I'm thinking, of course, from an operational standpoint of referring and law enforcement and et cetera. I just want to avoid any confusion in that regard. Yes, Ms. Nixon.
Yeah, I just happen to have their web pages open on these programs. It looks like Whatcom Community Detox on their website is what they're calling that. And Compass Health has it listed as Crisis Triage and Stabilization. So that might be the program names.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, appreciate any other thoughts and information. I'm sure we'll be able to clarify that and work that process out. I believe we are to the point of public comment. Jill, are there attendees?
There are no attendees, either online or in person.
Well, it's probably an advertisement thing, you know, it probably didn't get out there. I know that there's a lot of folks that are interested in this information, so I'm more than happy to answer any of those questions at all.
Next time.
Yes, absolutely. Again, very much appreciate the time. I know y'all are busy and super appreciate you stepping in and just providing that information. Really excited about our the next things that are going to be occurring relative to the Crisis Stabilization Center. So without further ado, I will adjourn the meeting at this point.